broadcasting. Oh, let me resume recording. And I'm going to start broadcasting. So we are live. Okay, looks like we have 34 attendees and counting. This is really great. We'll give it about 2 more minutes and then we will begin the program. So if you're joining us, welcome. And thank you for joining us on this Sunday. Okay, I know that we are continuing to wait for people to join us, but I would like to get started on our introduction so that we have enough time to run through our program, and we have a lot of good content for you to think about and to participate with us in. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today titled Our Communities, Climate Change and COVID-19. My name is Akemi Chan Imai, and I am the Programs Manager at Oakland Asian Cultural Center. OACC's mission is to build vibrant communities through API arts and cultural programs that foster intergenerational and cross-cultural dialogue, understanding, collaboration, and social justice. It is my great pleasure to present this event with our key partner, Eastwind Books Multicultural Services. And we are also fortunate to have support from other community organizations, including the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Asian Pacific American Student Development, the Multicultural Community Center, and Critical Impact Consulting. This event is also made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'd like to go over some notes before we begin the program. First, we are streaming this webinar on YouTube Live as well at the same time. The link will be posted in the chat box in case you would like to access it or share it with others during this time. Please also note that this event is being recorded and we will be muting all participants to help us preserve the audio quality. Please use the chat function in Zoom or YouTube Live to type in any questions you have. We will have an audience Q&A near the end of the program. And after this event, please help us by filling out our evaluation survey. We're posting the link in the chat box and we will also email it to you after the event. And as a note, please remember to enter our grant ID in the first field of the survey. That just helps to move you to the next section. And now I'd like to hand it over to our facilitator, Harvey Dong.
Welcome, everybody. Our event title is Our Communities, Climate Change and COVID-19. Today's panel will address the climate crisis, the struggle for environmental justice, and interrelated to the climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Our panelists today include Julie C., who is a professor of American Studies and founding director of the Environmental Justice Project at UC Davis. She's the author of Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger. Her work discusses how the climate crisis connects with struggles against racism, gender violence, and exploitation of people and natural resources. Julie will be joined by a panel conversation, which will include Sheena Robinson, policy coordinator with the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, APEN, and environmental justice organization based in California's Asian immigrant and refugee communities. Also, Ratha Lai is here. He's the executive director of Critical Impact Consulting. He's been involved in racial justice campaigns and initiatives for the past decade, with half being in environmental justice. Russell Jiang, also here, is a professor of Asian American Studies at SF State and author of Family Sacrifices, the World Views and Ethics of Chinese Americans. And he's also the editor, along with myself, of the book, the new release, Mountain Movers, Student Activism and the Emergence of Asian American Studies. Myself, I'm Harvey Dong. I'm the moderator assigned for today, and I'm a lecturer in Asian American and Asian Diaspora Studies and Ethnic Studies. And I'm also part of Eastwind Books of Berkeley. Okay, okay, so Julie's going first, and she will speak about her book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, which will help provide a backdrop on looking at climate change, environmental justice, crisis, and recovery. We had originally scheduled her book talk at the Oakland Asian Cultural Center and had canceled it due to the pandemic crisis. But the climate crisis and COVID-19 pandemic crisis find interconnection, and we wanted to make the best use of our time to deal with it with this panel. So first, we'll have Julie, and I have a number of questions, but the first question that I have is, how did you yourself become interested in the environmental justice movement? What got you involved?
Well, I have been working with environmental justice movements since I was a student activist, and I was a student at UC Berkeley in the 90s when environmental justice started becoming a thing that people used, a term, environmental racism and environmental justice movements. So I actually took a lot of ethnic studies classes at UC Berkeley. So it's going full circle in a lot of ways. I was a student organizer around environmental justice issues, and then I worked in New York City, where I'm from, around for an organization called Environmental Justice Alliance. I also grew up in Chinatown in New York City, And I think that a lot of my early interests in environmental justice really come from my background and personal experiences growing up in Chinatown and not really understanding a lot of the history or I just sort of took it for granted that, Chinatown, was how people grew up. And then I went to Berkeley and I took ethnic studies classes with people like Ron Takaki, and I learned a lot more history that I had never ever learned before. And so my interest in social movements really drives a lot of my work and research. My research has always been grounded in movements, starting as a student and then as an organizer. And a lot of my research is based on long-term relationships. My collaborator in New York, I've worked with for about 25 years. We still write together. I've done a lot of work in the Central Valley as well. So that's sort of me and how I got into it. It was a sort of I took a race, poverty, and environment class with Carl Anthony, and I didn't really know who Carl Anthony was, but he is an important environmental justice leader in the Bay Area. So a lot of it was sort of accidental, but since my early introduction to racial justice and environmental justice, it's just been a consistent thread for that time.
And then tying into that is in your research and in your book, what have been some of the ways in which climate justice have hit peoples of color especially hard? Because you cover a lot of different communities in your book, right? But it seems to be an underlying theme there with regards to how it's hitting peoples of color.
Right. So this recent book, Environmental Justice in a Moment of Danger, that just came out in January, talks about, what is the moment of danger we're in? And the questions that animate the book, again, are grounded from movements themselves, but also informed by the questions that I'm really interested in. So the key question of the book is, what kind of crossroads and moment of danger are we in now? And most importantly, what might we learn from environmental justice movements in our moment of danger? And to be fair, to the audience and others, this is a short, synthetic book. It's not meant to be like an overview of all environmental justice everywhere. I wrote this book really out of the election in 2016. And the book is structured around case studies and keywords. So, I have a chapter on Standing Rock that really looks at settler colonialism and indigenous movements. I have a chapter on privatization, neoliberalism that looks at Flint, Michigan and the water crisis and connecting it to the Central Valley, water and other injustices in the Central Valley. And then the last chapter looks at Hurricane Katrina as opening up this kind of era that, and then that chapter closes with Hurricane Maria. So that chapter deals most clearly with the climate crisis and climate justice. And so paradoxically, the argument of the book is that we have never been in a greater moment of danger. But on the other hand, this is the most important time to look at the arguments and the struggles of environmental justice and other justice movements. The moment of danger we're in, however you start however you want to periodize it, whether it's first contact and colonialism of 500 plus years and modernity itself, all the way through to civil rights activism. Or you could say, if you want to put it much more narrow, the rise of naming things as environmental racism, which really only that terminology only really existed since the 90s onward. Whatever start point you want to use now, justice movements articulate what the problems are and what the stakes are very clearly. And that's the key lesson of why we need to listen to what movements have been saying and are saying now, not to just judge movements by whether they're successful, succeed or fail. If you go back to the last slide, the Noxious New York is based on the New York work. I edited this collection on sustainability, which makes an argument about sustainability has to take into account social justice, which in a lot of ways to a lot of people seems fairly obvious, but in the environmental sciences and sustainability, that's not necessarily true. That social justice is a factor. And the middle book, which we'll get back to later on, is about climate change, looking at an eco-city in China that actually my family is from, and looking at climate change from a global lens and through the lens of this, the rise of the so-called Chinese century, decline of the American century, and so on. And so that book looks at how the climate crisis it becomes talked about through the lens of China. And I think there's a lot of important lessons that we can think about as we see this kind of anti-Chinese rhetoric around the virus rising as well. So that's the sort of research I've done. Some is more or less, focused with communities themselves, but that's a clear thread for me. I think the danger that I'm talking about in the moment of danger is around anti-immigrant sentiments, nationalist, populist authoritarianism, which is not just a US-based political reality right now, but it's also true in places like Brazil and in Hungary, in India, and so on. So anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiments, nationalist, populist authoritarianism, militarized security discourse, and racist public policies. And so these are both national and also international. In a lot of ways, I like to periodize the moment we're in and this is, I understand this is my own experience, but, coming of age in the 90s, a lot of the activism in the Bay Area was around this incredibly regressive anti-immigrant, anti-209, three strikes and you're out, this kind of very, very pre-MAGA politics in California, which a lot of the younger people don't really know that much history of. And so a lot of the justice activists in the 90s, labor, environmental, reproductive justice, they articulated what the problems were. And what we see right now is the logical endpoint of their critique from the 90s onward. So my stance has always been listen to what movements say. They're mostly right. So. And then the next slide is just a couple of examples of projects I've worked on. I think storytelling and foregrounding the narratives of environmental justice activists and other justice activists is really a central part of the work that I do. I think environmental justice is really the reason why it was so compelling to me in the 90s and remains important as a framework is because of how connective the analytic is. The idea that environmentalism is connected to race and class, and that you can't separate environmental and health and planning and social justice and injustice, that's a very powerful worldview, and it's a very powerful way of understanding what problems are, but also in, as this panel will talk about, what are the responses that we can make that don't exacerbate the already existing inequalities, whether they're environmental, political, health, or social.
Another question I have too is you talk a lot about how all these movements interconnect, but you also address in your book the importance to look at it through a climate justice lens. I was wondering if you could talk about what does it mean to apply a climate justice lens to look at all these social issues that are taking place today. How does that? How do you apply that? Yeah, with a climate justice lens. Yeah.
Right, and the climate justice framework, and for those of you who are unfamiliar with these principles, movement principles, principles of environmental justice, principles of climate justice, the Hermes principles for working together. I think the environmental justice movements and other justice movements create really powerful frameworks. And so again, that question of how have climate change hit people of color especially hard is a really important question in climate justice analysis. So the classic way of thinking about environmental justice and climate change would be through the lens of distributive impacts. Are the people who are responsible really facing the effects the worst? And actually, no, it's the opposite. The people who are least responsible tend to be the ones who are worst hit. So there's a lot of distributive injustice components of it. There's a lot of procedural justice components to climate change, which is who gets to make policy, who is at the table, and so on. So the justice lens, I think, that is the core is the focus on power and the focus on power as the lens of thinking about causes and solutions. And you can see lots of examples of this. And I really think Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria exemplify this very well. Also the militarized response that happened, especially after Katrina. In terms of AAPI and refugee climate justice issues, I think the rest of the panel will also be touching on them. But there are so many examples where a climate injustice lens makes sense for AAPI and refugee communities, whether that's the Pacific Islands and other small island nations that are already vulnerable to sea level rise. For example, in the Marshall Islands. And I know in Sacramento, where I live, there is a diaspora of Marshallese populations and a very active youth climate justice organizing around climate justice issues. Countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam are particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, and also the disasters that come from intensifying conditions like cyclones and so on. The AAPI refugee populations in the US face unique vulnerabilities at home and at work, and that was before COVID. Before the refugee program basically was being completely shut down. AAPI communities are impacted by gentrification, ongoing legacies of war and violence, and also contemporary authoritarianism, again, as a global phenomenon in places like Brazil and India. So I think if that gives you some sense of the wide variety of what climate injustice looks like, and how it might be particularly impacting AAPI and refugee communities. That's at least an opening starting point, but we'll talk about it in the panel as well.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Julie, for this overview. And the next part is we'll focus on one person's story, a community member in Oakland, California, and how he got involved in the environmental justice movement. And this man's name is Hypo. Okay, so we'll watch a video.
我叫潘海波，我是1929年1月15号出生的。很幸运，我与伟大的民权领袖马丁·路德·金是同年同月同一天的生日。我是1943年进入铁路43，一直工作到1990年，差不多接近50年，是做修理火车的技术工人。感受是很同情那些人，同情这些成天跟煤炭烟尘接触的这些那些人呢，都变成了黑脸，衣服都是黑的。这个不要紧，这是外表，可以洗得掉，吸到肺里头去了，让那个肺吸收了这些尘。那个煤矿工人呐、采石场啊、采矿的工人呐、到了30、40岁、40、50岁都是矽肺病。 那就是看到要死的，没法治的。我是1991年移民到奥克兰，就没有换过地方，一直在这里。所以后来我到了美国来了以后啊，这个空气这么新鲜，我很高兴。啊，我这样人的寿命都会长一些。广大市民来讲，那是很重要。 每一个城市都有一个常年的比较多的那个风向， 叫做中国话来讲就是常年的季风。美国的地图我好像没有发现，中国好多地图上面有一个玫瑰图，就是画的像个五星啊、八星一样的，它有个箭头指到一个方向。这个是这个城市的常年季候风，附近的居民呢，长期吸这个粉尘对身体是很有害。主要这个粉尘呢，吸到肺里去，因为煤炭有很多毒素的。有人来介绍我说这里有一个亚太环保网络，我说他做什么的？他是搞环保节能。哎，好，我有兴趣的，所以我把我知道的，我跟议员们，跟我们 APEN 组织都讲。这样子的话呢，大家都爱护这个地球，爱护环境，见到破坏环境的应该反对，对吧？像我们反对煤炭运输就属于这个，让人类能够世世代代很幸福地生活下去。
And our first panelist, Sheena Robinson from Asian Pacific Environmental Network, will address the video and talk about her work in the environmental justice movement. Sheena?
Yeah, hi everyone. My internet's a little unstable, so I'm going to hold off on the video right now. But yeah, I'm so grateful to be able to share upon Hypo's story with everyone. I think it's a great introduction to APEN. He's a longtime member of ours, and the video was made for a local campaign to stop coal coming through the Port of Oakland. And it just shows how connected our struggles are from our homelands to here, and the power of intergenerational organizing and the wisdom that comes from being able to tell those stories. So APEN is a grassroots environmental justice organization based in Richmond and Oakland, Chinatown. Our roots are with our Asian immigrant and Southeast Asian refugee members. Next slide, please. So our first building block in our work is organizing. So building community leadership, and that's embedded in all of our work. Here are some examples of some of our youth interns. Again, we're intergenerational space, as well as a local campaign to protect Chinatown, where members were powerful spokespeople in standing up to a large institution. Next slide. Another strategy is civic engagement. So we mobilize the Asian American vote. APEN reaches out to Asian voters several times a year to talk about these intersections of racial justice, economic equity, and climate solutions in 7 Asian languages. And next slide. We also work on state level policy to take climate solutions to scale. And so here's an example of our leaders advance, where we were voting on between 2 policies that they actually helped write, and we're deciding on which one to run through the California legislature the next year. And an example of an event we held in the Capitol. So that's part of my role. I get to support our leaders growing their advocacy skills to demand change at the state level, both in passing and implementing policy to ensure state benefits come back to our local communities. And through that, we're learning just how bold and intersectional the solutions are that come from our communities, and how much the structures in the Capitol are not set up to push those forward yet, but we're changing the culture of what leaders look like in our civic institutions. And next slide, please. Lastly, we know our strength comes from being part of a movement of movements. So much of what we're all working on is rooted in the same system of extraction and exploitation that causes harm to both people and planet. So it's really important that we build our relationships across organizations, across sectors, across issues, across geographies, across cultures, and really be in solidarity. So we definitely make a point to include our staff and our members in different organizing efforts and delegations to lend our support to key movements across the climate justice spectrum.
Oh, can you explain the the three banners that are there? Because that's at Standing Rock, huh?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
So we were able to send a couple staff to be part of an Asian American delegation to Standing Rock. And many of us also wear other hats. So my other hat is organizing with the Filipino community. So we had a bunch of these banners, and we're able to make the connections between kind of the fossil fuel and extractive economy happening in our homelands and what that looks like there, as well as in Standing Rock. And I think being there really was eye-opening. We often don't see kind of the level of impacts of imperialism within North America the way that we do when we go abroad. But on native land, it was in full force. And so it was really important to be able to show that solidarity of our roots and where we come from, and the way that the economy is impacting our communities across the world. And then just really quickly, last slide, a little on a personal note, that the photo on the left is where I grew up. I grew up across the street from a refinery that regularly flares. It still shakes the doors and windows of my parents' house when they do that. And it's one of 2 refineries in the state that still uses modified hydrofluoric acid, which is a potent and ground-hugging toxic gas. And on the right is a photo, again, because I organized in the Filipino community with Gabriela Oakland, was able to do a political exposure trip. And so some Indigenous youth are telling us a story of the conditions that they face. So being able to have such a political relationship to my homeland has showed me kind of the unfiltered impacts of climate injustice, inequality, and just really lighting the fire of why we need our land and our soil and our water and air to be clean to do the work that we need. Yeah, and that's it for me for now.
Okay, great. So next on board is Ratha Lai, who's also a longtime participant in the environmental justice movement. I knew Ratha when he was a student at UC Berkeley, when he was fighting against cutbacks in the ethnic studies program. Yeah, I remember him being involved in that hunger strike. Yeah, so that's how I remember Ratha. But so what have you been doing since then, and how did you get involved in the environmental justice movement?
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and I was really excited to hear from you, because it brought me back to the days when I was organizing, and I was involved in like 2 different hunger strikes when I was a student organizer at Cal, and one of them was for ethnic studies. They were trying to consolidate all the ethnic studies departments. But yeah, I'm super excited. I'm gonna try to do my best to give a summary of what I've been up to. I've been super busy, so it's sometimes I hear a lot of people say it's really hard to try to catch up and follow what I've been doing. So it's a rare opportunity to kind of share what I've been up to for a while. So yeah, next slide. Just to give folks kind of an overview of the different areas that I've been, starting off from the top left is my community college emblem. So that's kind of where I got politicized. I grew up in Los Angeles and went to community college and discovered the nerd in me and got really politicized. And then from there, I was actually able to transfer to UC Berkeley. And my goal at UC Berkeley was to try to develop as many best tools to be a political organizer. And my idea was to take as many Nobel laureate classes as I possibly can. And so I was an interdisciplinary studies field major. And from there, I also got involved with the Bridges Multicultural Resource Center. So I know there's some Bridges students that are in there, are watching this right now. So that's where I got a big amount of my leadership development, and was really privileged to just be involved in a lot of different organizing efforts. And from there, I went to the Greenlining Institute, which is a racial justice public policy institute. So I got a really good chance to take a view of how statewide policy look like, and then different policy campaigns. And then my EJ career really started with the Sierra Club San Francisco Bay chapter. And in 2014, I was part of the Team Richmond campaign that helped to beat Chevron. So Chevron back in 2014 pumped over $4 million into the local election. And in Richmond, Richmond's like a town of 100,000 residents. So over $4 million for over 100,000 residents it meant political advertisements everywhere. But we ended up beating that group, and I was actually on a short-term contract, and I got more exposure and more work, and went from working that campaign to trying to cap refinery pollution. And the refinery caps campaign really is intertwined with the cap and trade. And then all that kind of just segued into transitioning into my time at the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, which I really loved. I was part of the Team Richmond group, and Richmond is a refinery town. And yeah, being part of that, organizing with the senior citizens and the Laotian refugee community in Richmond was really, really rewarding for me to be connected to my roots. And throughout all of this, I've always been doing coalition work. So the Richmond Our Power Coalition was one of the last recent places that I was at from like 2016 to just recently. And that's a coalition bringing 9 different organizations together in Richmond to promote a just transition. So that's what Julie was talking about in terms of how do we find the intersections of our community and environmental justice and connect all those things together. And then now I have my own consulting firm, Critical Impact Consulting. So I am helping out the network that I've built over for the last 10 years, and kind of just wanted to work more with my hats off. And so one of the clients I work with right now is a Safe Return Project. So they work on ending mass incarceration. And right now with COVID-19 and its impacts, there's a lot of implications on what does it mean for people who have been unjustly incarcerated, been part of the mass incarceration system, to return safely home. So next slide, and then yeah, so my family is super important. On the left is my partner and our daughter, and that's me. And the middle picture is when she was first born. She was born prematurely, so that's it's a big percent. If you live in a refinery town, it's a really large percentage of babies that get born prematurely. So she was like super tiny. She has little swaddles right there. She had to get like, supported a lot, but she's all good now. That's our most recent picture right before the shutdown happened. She got really into dinosaurs. So yeah, so she's a big part of my life, and a big motivation or a big reminder, and gives me perspective when I'm doing organizing work. And then yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so on the top left is an old photo from the Bridges office in Eshelman before it got remodeled. So that was just my time there. And so any Bridges students are in here right now. So a little sneak peek from a snapshot of what the wall used to be like. It used to be all tagged up and everything. It was really cool. The next picture is with me. Wait, go back. Yeah. Next picture over is me canvassing with the California Nurses Association. So they were a huge part of my organizing, and we organized the Richmond Coal campaign was a really long campaign that started, and the nurses kind of helped gather a big health data and the impacts of coal. And it was really great because when my daughter was born, they really showed up in terms of showing up and helping care for my daughter and reciprocate all that love. So that's the Greenlining Action Team, my time at Greenlining. And also at the bottom left right there is the Chevron fire in 2012. That was a really big fire that sent over 15,000 people to the hospital. And that really set a chain reaction of how the next picture over you see here is the 2014 campaign with Team Richmond. So this is literally right when we found out that they won. It was election night and they won. Everybody crowded into the room, and it was a really fun night. Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, and then so just progressing through my different areas. On the top left there, my time with the Richmond Our Power Coalition, you know, I had multiple hats, but the two home organizations that I had was the Asian Pacific Environmental Network and Communities for a Better Environment, and did a whole bunch of stuff. So I'll probably share out on other things, but I do want to get through this. And then these two pictures over here, if folks were here a couple of years ago, there was the Solidarity to Solutions Week of Action. It was a huge protest that brought a lot of climate justice organizers to the Bay Area to protest how companies were beginning to profit from climate exploitation. So we were protesting how the solutions that were being promoted were poison policies, right? Poison apple policies, as we would call them, where it would seem appealing to the community, but in the end, it would actually benefit corporations and then hurt us and then displace us in our turn. So that was a huge turnout from groups from all over the place. So next slide. Yeah, and also part of the work that I was really privileged to do was to be part of the Chorus community. So the Chorus Foundation is an awesome foundation. They funded 4 communities for long-term projects on the just transition. Those 4 communities is Richmond, California, Buffalo, New York, Alaska, the whole state of Alaska, and Kentucky. And we would go on these learning exchanges and learn from each other and these different just transition activities. So on the top right here is Kentucky. We had gone to Kentucky and really learned about the impacts of coal mining and really how the coal companies just did the whole community there really, really awful. They went in there, all these different, it was like, it was really, really bad. Like in terms of how corporations, it was a playbook on how do you destroy a community, and the coal companies were just writing it there. And in terms of how they could take away people's money and then turn a whole community into poverty is crazy. So that was a really eye-opening journey. And then at the bottom right here is the Richmond People's Assembly. So this was the Richmond Our Power Coalition, and we just did a lot of organizing. That was a really cool event. We had canvassed over 1,000 survey responses on just a simple question. It was just what people, how people were doing. Like what our intention and our goal was to try to create a conversation starter, and from there create a really meaningful data and feedback on what's impacting the community now, and help frame the city council elections going forward. In the bottom right is an image from Alaska. And when I was asked to talk about climate refugees and to think about climate refugees, this was one of the situations I thought about. In going to Alaska as part of the Chorus Community Exchange, people are literally losing their homes to erosion, right? What we thought about erosion as slow and gradual becomes super drastic. And as you can see here, this group, this community that has been in this town, and they're like fishing villages along the river, they are losing their homes really quickly. And this was taken about a year ago. So a lot of the situations that people have just been having to move and leave their homes and find new places to kind of live. And so that kind of wraps up my time with my EJ career. And right now, I started my own consulting company this past year, so I'm super excited about that, and looking forward to continuing my work and figuring out where I'm going to be working next and with which groups I'm going to be working with next. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Ratha. Going across the Bay to SF State and San Francisco, we're going to hear from Russell Jiang. So Russell, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. So how has the recent climate disasters hit the immigrant communities in particular SF Chinatown.
Yeah, well, I'd like to thank Harvey and Bee from Eastwind Books and Akemi from Oakland Asian Cultural Center for hosting us. Recent climate change has had disproportionate impact on communities of color like Chinatown. And, you know, San Francisco Chinatown has always suffered from environmental racism, where our community of color has been disproportionately negatively impacted where we live and where we work and where we play. And just one quick example is my dad grew up in Chinatown, San Francisco. We were there all the time. He worked there. And so I actually caught tuberculosis just because I hung out at Chinatown. And that was an example of environmental racism where the entire community is more likely to get a disease because of where we live and because of its density. It's not our fault. And the same way, Chinatown, because it's a heat island and there's less green space, Chinatown gets more hot during severe weather conditions. So if you remember when we have periods of heat waves or if we have periods of wildfires, Chinatown, again, is disproportionately impacted. It gets smokier there, it gets hotter there. And if you know, Chinatown has a lot of SRO, single room occupancy hotels where people live in one room units and they have to share bathrooms and they have to share kitchens. So they're really dense, crowded conditions with low income elderly and limited English proficient families. And when you have a heat wave or when you have a smoky condition, it's really hard to live in these places because if they close the windows, it gets really, really hot. And again, with a crowded condition and you can't go out, it makes it really dangerous for the elderly who may have respiratory problems or young people. But if you open the windows, then you expose yourself to the smoke from the outside, or you expose yourself from the smells inside, so that the smells inside could be just as bad as the smells outside because it's so crowded. And so another example of how climate is impacting Chinatown SROs is just COVID-19, right? Because these units are so dense, there's a lot more likelihood that the coronavirus could spread in the conditions of these units. And we've had to take special precautions to protect families living there. So one of the things that we've done, next slide, is that at San Francisco State, we've been partnering with a community organizations to help address climate change in the neighborhood. And the environmental justice movement started in the 1990s, but in the 1970s, Chinatown organizations were already working on environmental justice before it became a popular term. Chinatown organizations were working on where we live and developing affordable housing. They were working on where we work and trying to provide safer places. And they worked on open spaces and where we played. So today, San Francisco State is working with Chinese Community Development Center, Chinese Progressive Association, NICOS, and the Chinatown Disaster Preparedness Committee to try to figure out how can we make the housing conditions of SROs safe and more cool, especially during these severe heat waves. So my students are partnering with these organizations, especially with the tenants of these units and these buildings, to come up with solutions. And so I'm just going to quickly come up with what our students have come up with, their solutions. And what we're going to do is talk with the tenants, because we really believe in the right of self-determination, that people should be involved in the decisions that affect them. And so we're going to go back to the tenants and ask them what they think are the best solutions, and then try to work together to implement them. So these are some of the solutions that students and the community are coming up with together to address climate change. One is rooftop painting, that if you simply paint over dark, hot roofs which trap the heat and cover them with a protective coating, that actually reflects a lot of heat and cools the building and saves energy costs. So that's one first thing. And that would be a fun project for everybody to come around and just paint rooftops. Another solution, next slide, is planting green roofs. And this is a really positive solution too, because not only do we give people a place to gather and to build community, but it's also a place where we can preserve cultural traditions of growing Asian crops. And so this might be harder because the roofs might not be able to bear so much weight of the garden. So we're examining the cost and the weight of putting in community gardens on roofs. Another solution that we have is that a lot of people say Portsmouth Square is the living room of Chinatown where people just come out and play. But again, it's not very well covered, and you could expose yourself to a lot of the sunlight. So what we may propose, if it's feasible and cost effective, is to put in more planters that could create shade overhead, but also with those planters have a misting system. So it cools the community, shades the community, and gives the community a place to gather as well. And finally, our fourth solution is that to put in more cooling stations sponsored by the government that are more accessible and enjoyable for the residents. So I don't know if you guys know, but there's actually a community center underneath Portsmouth Square, but it's hardly ever used. And so this would be actually a policy solution where if enough residents like this idea, we'd push our board of supervisors to budget to make this a cooling station, and not just make it open for people, but actually make it a cultural gathering space where we would have activities for the seniors, games for kids, something that would draw them rather than just a place to be. So that's what our students are doing. And again, we were interrupted by the shelter in place, so we couldn't get to talk to all the families in the SROs. And so now, because of COVID-19, we've really shifted this semester to actually looking at anti-Asian violence and discrimination. And that's a whole nother environmental racism issue. You know, I don't know, do you want to ask a question about that, Harvey, or do you want me to talk about that? You have to unmute.
Yeah, if you could talk about briefly about how anti-immigration and the recent Chinese virus speeches from the White House has endangered our communities, and then we'll definitely address that in the general panel discussion also, just as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So quickly,
yeah.
The Republican Party has made it a campaign to China bash, and they're saying China is poisoning us, and they're blaming China. They're, sponsoring a lot of resolutions blaming China for the coronavirus. And again, this is an environmental justice issue. That just as hate speech can create a hostile workplace, or hate speech could create a hostile classroom, I think the Republicans' campaign speeches are actually creating a hostile world climate. And it's dangerous in several ways. And one is that it has a disproportionate impact on Asian Americans. So with Chinese for Affirmative Action, we've created a reporting center. We've received over 1,500 cases of anti-Asian incidents across the nation from 46 states. So that's just another sort of environmental issue that impacts the Asian American community. It's just our public safety and our security is clearly threatened now by what's going on as a result of this pandemic.
Then we'll have that as also part of the general discussion. Okay. Further elaboration on it. Okay. Okay, so for the next part here is a general panel discussion, and the panel, there's an introductory piece there by Anthony Carifa Rogers Wright, who was involved in the Climate Justice Alliance. We won't be playing that, but we'll send you the links. But essentially, Anthony Rogers Wright discusses the interconnect between the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis. He underscores that the most vulnerable peoples are those peoples of color, poor whites who reside in communities and locations where environmental and health regulations are the weakest and least enforced, if there are any. Those locations are designated sacrifice zones where toxins, waste, pollution lead to compromise immune systems. And then with the COVID-19 crisis, the situation is magnified even more. And it has reached a, not just a situation of damage, but a situation of inequality and death within these communities. So one main question that we have here is, how has COVID-19 impacted communities that are already on the front lines of climate change? How has it impacted people's efforts towards environmental justice? Okay, so linkage between COVID-19 and the struggle for environmental justice. Okay, how do we see these interconnects? Okay, Russell brought one already in terms of increased racism. And the other thing is, besides talking about the crisis and problems itself, what can we do about it? What type of solutions can we do to come together so that we don't just become victims ourselves and we just hear the stuff on TV spewed out, speeches by politicians and media, that there's nothing we can do about it except to wait, you know?
I think one of the most important, not one of, but a very big factor is that the Trump administration is using COVID-19 as a cover to accelerate its attack on environmental regulations. And, you know, this has been, the EPA, which is supposed to protect the environment, has been handed over to oil and natural gas interests. And, you know, that's only accelerated. The COVID crisis has become just the way to nail it down, you know, pulling all regulations, whether it's environmental, whether it's on car emissions, whether it's on, you know, border and refugee policy. And so, you know, I think that we have to really watch what's happening. And, you know, the Trump administration is using COVID to basically nail in their agenda. And that's true all across the board, not just with environmental regulations, but it's very, very apparent when it comes to environmental regulation right now in policymaking. And in terms of what you can do, you know, there's the same things that have always been done, except it's hard to do the in-person organizing right now, you know, but lawsuits and so on. So I don't know, but that's absolutely part of the context that the pro-regulation, the pro-oil and gas and anti-regulation impulses, that's just being nailed right now.
So it's important to monitor and address it, because I heard something along the lines of there's been 95 deregulation attempts going on right now, you know, something along those lines. So so that would be important in terms of the monitoring, informing ourselves. Okay. What else is there that what can people do about it? I know Sheena showed the video of her folks' home with that, you know, the gas spewing above the refineries and things like that. What's been going on in the Richmond area, you know, Ratha and Sheena, in terms of experience that's been gained, you know, to fight for environmental justice? You know, how's that shaping up, given that we're in this COVID-19 situation?
Yeah, some quick thoughts. Definitely sitting with what's happening right now in terms of deregulation of these polluting industries, and just how much pollution both is harming our communities and has made them more vulnerable to pandemics like this. And I think hearing from the Capitol as well, you know, that the industries are really well financed, so they're continuing to lobby while we're at home, you know, they have the resources to make sure that legislators are hearing from them about the need to deregulate to protect their profits in this time. And there's also a lot of criminalization going around in terms of dissent and protesting fossil fuels that we're seeing, especially in Indigenous communities. And I want to highlight the opportunity to decriminalize both dissent and protest, and also kind of low carbon or carbon friendly behavior that our communities are also doing, even though they have, you know, they're bearing the biggest brunt of environmental pollution and racism, as well as contributing the least to it. So I'm just thinking of our communities in Oakland, Chinatown that, you know, walk everywhere, take the bus, have local groceries. The way that they live is very carbon friendly. And there are other ways that before this crisis, other things in our communities were being extremely criminalized. So people who need to take public transit but can't afford the fare. So much was being spent on policing fare evaders, or people who have been put on the street because of the housing crisis, and how much of the fines and evictions have been leading into that. And now we're seeing a state response that is actually, given the crisis, like, well, actually transit is now free, or, you know, we're going to dedicate these hotel rooms for people who are houseless. And so I think it's showing that a lot of what was being criminalized and the ways that we were being extracted from can actually shift in this moment if we come together and build renter power, worker power, student power to hold on to some of these opportunities in the moment. And I think, yeah, it's a situation to adapt to in terms of our organizing. But I also think back to, you know, Hypo and other of our elders who have organized in very different conditions in their homelands under different regimes or dictatorships, or, you know, pre-social media. And so I think it's an opportunity to put our heads together and think about ways we can continue that work. Technology is definitely a tool, but it's not the foundation. The relationships are the foundation. And I think what one positive thing that we're seeing out of this is some of the mutual aid that is arising in the face of everything that's going on. And so very quickly after the shelter in place order, APEN started a community response and stabilization fund that we were able to meet our goal in just go beyond our goal in just a couple of days in terms of providing food delivery, supply delivery, direct cash assistance to families, and have been able to match that from local community foundations. So I think that there are deep relationships that are rooting us and helping us weather this storm, and a lot of wisdom at our backs because of the organizing in different conditions. So I think those are a couple of things that feel hopeful that people can plug into.
Ratha, do you have anything to add in terms of what's developing? Do we see any light at the end of the tunnel given this crisis situation?
Yeah, great question on the light at the end of the tunnel. I think there's always a light, right? So yeah, and I think what I have really seen out in the community is like, in the frontline community, we're already in a crisis, right? Most folks are living paycheck to paycheck. They're concerned about being pushed out with gentrification. They're already concerned about the compiling factors of their health. I have health complications, so just looking at and just seeing how the community has really responded to it, I've really seen like the anxiety across the community really pick up, but I've also seen the resilience as well. And I've also seen like community members go like, well, you know, I've been in a crisis for a really long time. This extra crisis isn't that bad because I'm just able to deal with it so much better. And I see that, and I'm thinking like, yes, that's great. That's part of also of our resilience. And then how do we also honor that resilience and then take it to the next level? And part of what I see as the next level is just being really politically organized, and really being much more organized and being politically involved. And I think COVID-19 is really putting a magnifying glass to not just to all the cracks in the systems, and how the system was propped up and built up off exploitation, and how that exploitation is still prominent around. And what I think what COVID-19 is doing now is it's stressing that out so much that people are not going to be able to fall back and hide away, right? We have to be in community now. You can't really, you can't really hide away or be part of your own group. You can't kind of stay within your own, you can't hide behind money. You can't hide behind your own community. We're in a point where the entire economy has shifted, and we have to depend, not necessarily, we have to be mindful and have solidarity with each other. And I think that's what I've really been seeing as well, is the solidarity that has really picked up, to kind of see the massive amount of shelter in place that has really taken, and people that have really been taking to that is a real big act of solidarity, right? To know like, hey, you know what, I'm okay, but I'm letting go of my lifestyle or whatever it is, because it's more important that my community stays alive right now. And the way that COVID-19, the way I kind of understand it, is that it shuts down the healthcare system, right? It's a super fast contagious disease that will wipe out people that already have pre-existing conditions. So we already have an aging population. We already have folks, and then now you're talking about communities that live in Richmond that deal with air pollution all the time. And now you have a super really contagious virus that the way it impacts and it creates a really mass death is it overwhelms the healthcare system. And so it's really dangerous to kind of live with so I think our communities are currently living with that. And at the same time, what we're also seeing as we're in our house is our politicians and the elected officials be really responsible with how this is being handled, right? And how it's being handled is being handled differently in a lot of different places. We have been able to shelter in place and haven't felt it, I feel, as bad. However, it's not the same story everywhere else. And yeah, so I think what I get concerned about is the people who are in power, people who are in the positions of power, haven't been really had the track record for giving us the justice and the equity that we need. And so now that COVID-19 has come and has really shut down the system, I really feel like they're still being active in terms of how do they profit the most and how do they come out of the most. And I think right now has been, I see like, it sucks that we can't door-to-door organize. However, it's also really lucky that we have a great technology to be able to organize at a way that we haven't been able to, and to be able to still build relationships. So yeah, so solutions that I see is like to really think about the solidarity that you can practice, and then be politically involved and organized. So, you know, organizations like the Asian Pacific Environmental Network has been doing a lot of political organizing around this for a really long time. So being able to plug into organizations like that and to be able to pull yourself with others creates that multiplier effect.
Russell, I was wondering the impact of the survey that your group did on anti-Asian hate, because it acquired a lot of data, right? And then you were able to analyze it. But what kind of social impact does that type of survey have? Because I know there's a lot of news coverage about the fact that there was a survey done. And it's ongoing. But what kind of impact does that have? And does it bring people together, or yeah?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think this is community knowledge that we think should be shared, that we have over 1,500 incidents of hate, and it's just a tip of the iceberg. And the way I really appreciated how at this Americans are lifting up their voices to stand up against racism. 8% were submitted in non-English languages. And I think we trust the organizations I've been working with. And so they get a lot more reports than the police would. And so, but we're not just giving a chance for people to grieve and air their grievances on a forum, but we're actually collecting it and actually saying, here are the community responses that we need for anti-bullying, for bystander intervention, for workplace discrimination, for hate crimes. What are your rights? And so we've been posting that to have targeted community responses. And we've also taken it to our state legislature and to the governor in California. So the API Legislative Caucus, Rata was talking about using our Solidarity for Power. We've been working pretty well with the Legislative Caucus to challenge the governor to make government agencies more responsive. One of the places where we're having a lot of confrontations are in businesses and stores, because that's the only place we interact with people. But Asian Americans should have the right to safe access to goods and services, and we're not getting provided that. So we're calling on the government and for corporations to say, this is our right, and to put up signage to ensure that, to tell the managers that we should need that. So I think we use our data to come up with really specific targeted interventions, and that's how we use. So one of the responses people can have is if you see anti-Asian bias, to report it, and then we use that to come up with a community voice. The other opportunities I think that are arising now is that as Asian Americans are getting racially profiled and they're super sensitive and hyper aware of how people see them and see them as threats or as disease carriers, then kids can empathize with other communities of color. And I think that's my hope, like Rata's hope, is that we would build stronger solidarities with other communities of color to challenge what's going on. COVID-19 is exposing our racial inequalities. African Americans are dying at 6 times the rate as others. In some states, it's 50 to 70% of the deaths are African American. The Latinx community is the hardest hit economically. And the Asian American community too, 1 out of 7 are undocumented. They don't have access to testing. They don't have access to stimulus checks. And so they're even more marginalized. So besides building solidarity with other communities of color, I think Asian Americans now are coming up and recognizing we have a common interest together, that people who think they're the model minority and who may be doctors, they're getting harassed at, even when they're serving patients, right? Their own patients are shunning them because they're Asian. And then again, Asians on the margins are likely to be impacted. So I think I see a real mobilization of Asian Americans at this time with a higher Asian American consciousness that is in solidarity with others. And so hopefully we'll use this as a mobilizing opportunity, because I think it's going to get worse. Just to warn you guys, as we stay sheltered in place longer, as the economy tanks, as Republicans use this as an issue and out, this is way worse than the Vincent Chin era. It could be as bad as 9/11 era for South Asians. And so we got to be prepared for not only interpersonal confrontations, but actually government policies directed against Asian Americans. And so we have to be prepared. And that's why, like Rata and Sheena said, we need that solidarity, or else one by one, Trump is picking us off.
Okay, so that would go into another question for Julie, who in her book discusses the danger, the crisis. Well, one is you talked about how they're trying to use the cover of the COVID-19 crisis to push through more deregulation, right? To loosen up on emissions and so forth. But another part in your book where you talk about the crisis is about how there's the use of anti-immigrant sentiments, nationalist, populist, authoritarianism, militarized security discourses, and racist policies are on the rise, and that these are all becoming linked internationally. So it doesn't look like a very good situation, right? Given the climate crisis, the rise of more authoritarianism, and then here we are. We're at the bottom of all this. Our communities are suffering from climate crisis, COVID-19. Is there any upside, in terms of what can be done? So first you outline it as this is taking place internationally. How can that be dealt with? Yeah.
Well, I think one of the questions that I've been really thinking about a lot is, what's the start point, or how do you, understand the era we're in? And for me, one of the start points is a lot of the organizing around free trade agreements in the 90s, NAFTA and so on. And the fight then, I think, is similar to the fight now, which was about how corporations wanted to move products, but they wanted to not move, they didn't want people to move. And so even though and the anti-globalization and the free trade battles, like the battle for Seattle, really tried to link, from the justice lens without the internet, a global labor, a global environmental movement that said, you can't have, people in making your stuff and then not have people and ideas and power from the standpoint of justice, moving around. So in some sense, I think we're in this moment, and Trump really used the anti-China and the Making America Great Again is a lot of reaction to that corporate-led globalization. And so I think one of the things that the justice movements back then, labor and environmental, and the justice movements now are trying to do is to think about how globalization looks like if it's not corporate led, and about making money and, enriching corporations and the elites. And so the rising economic inequality alongside with the rising carbon emissions, those things are connected. And what justice movements do really well, I think, and one of the most important things that justice movements do is to articulate this as a series of, frameworks, but also stories, where you're not talking about freedom as the freedom to buy shit. You know what I mean? Or the freedom to, like, now you see all of the people who are saying, oh, live free or die, get rid of the stay in place, orders and so on. Freedom doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want, and then corporations mean a ton of money, So I think justice movements, one of the single most important things that they offer is how they narratively or from a story framework are retelling this story of who the victims are, who the perpetrators are, and what the alternative narrative that's not the dominant one coming from Fox or the political elites is. And that, for me, that centrally is around delinking freedom and markets. And, here I want to echo what Sheena and Ratha were saying is, the COVID-19 kind of blows apart, any of the perception that there wasn't enough money for whatever it is. There's not enough money for a post-carbon, reality. Look at the $2 trillion bailouts that happened right after COVID. So it just blows apart that argument. So where I have hope, and this is, it's hard to have hope for me, I'll be honest, but this is an important part of the book because the chapter that's talking about disasters and crisis and recovery also tries to talk about radical hope. And how do we have that when it feels so hopeless right now, especially from a climate change perspective? And I think the radical hope is a non-naive optimism. And then for me, the non-naive optimism is that communities don't just roll over and die because the elites don't want them to exist. Do you know what I mean? The hope is in the fight. That's the only thing that keeps me centered, or it's one of the only things. So do I have hope? Yeah, I do, but I'm not deluded about what the scale and scope of the problems or the amount of money that's, you know, being thrown at agendas that I find completely, you know, it's like a lot of people are talking about the death cult of capitalism, you know, and I think that, you know, in the book I talk about that we're in at this moment where the death cult is around carbon, capitalism, and white supremacy. And so you see right now the forces of carbon, white supremacy, and capitalism, like they're losing their shit, you know, because they know how many more people are aligned with a justice framework. So that's the hope, but it's also the danger. And that's the paradox that we're in. So.
And with that, we'll go into our audience question and answer. Let's see. So,
Okay, let me just share this out. Yes, so if you have any questions, we did start getting, I did see about 2 questions that came in through the chat. And while we're doing that, I would also like to share out this slide. This is just some more ways for all of you in attendance to stay in touch with us. If you are really intrigued and inspired by what you're hearing, please, you know, feel free to reach out to any of us, follow us. There were a lot of great links and information posted in the chat. We will also make that publicly available once the recordings are ready for posting.
I'll read one of the questions. Okay, this one person stated that I am a project coordinator with Asian American Women Artists Association. Thanks so much for sharing. I was wondering if any of you have worked with artists to bring awareness and encourage engagement on these issues, and what kind of creative solutions or actions have come out of these relationships to build solidarity. AAWAA AWA is likely to put on an exhibit next year related to climate and environmental justice next year. And we would love to partner with APEN as well. Is it possible to get in touch with all the panelists? Okay, okay, so I guess there's 2 parts. One is, I was wondering if any of you have worked with artists to bring awareness and encourage engagement on this issue. I think we were trying to design a logo, but and does anybody have thoughts on that? So definitely art is an important part of building a social movement.
Yeah, I mean, Sheena was at Standing Rock, so she can talk about her experiences there or other, but I'm in the chapter on Standing Rock, but also in some of the other parts that, you know, in the book, art is a huge part of that narrative of hope. You know, you don't have movements without people busting out incredible creativity and beauty and music. You know, one of the people I work with in New York says, our organizing has to look like the communities we come from. It has to sound like us. It has to taste like us. It has to move and feel like us. And art is a huge part of that.
Yeah, I sort of agree. You know, we were presented with all these scientific facts about climate change, but it doesn't move people. But what moves people are when you change their minds and their hearts. And I think that's why artists and storytellers, and actually religion, is one of the main ways that people could be moved towards environmental justice.
And there's another question here. Is there some way to make sense of the anti-Trump, pro-Biden ads, which are centered around the messages of yellow peril and Trump being weak on China during this pandemic? Okay.
I haven't seen those ads, so I can't speak, but Russell, in our pre-meeting, we were talking about, you know, what is the position of how do we not also do what Andrew Yang said, which was be more patriotic, be more American, and that's going to be the answer to the anti-Chinese rhetoric, because I don't think that's the solution either. And I think the tricky solution, the tricky place is going to be around how do you navigate this? And you could see it in the carbon case, like when China overtook the US in emissions, and then suddenly everybody was obsessed with Chinese pollution, rather than thinking about how the Chinese pollution was tied to the global framework as the world's factory, et cetera, et cetera. So how are you critical of, Chinese policy around emissions and the party and all that stuff, but not fall into the yellow peril rhetoric? And that's a very tricky kind of line. I haven't seen this ad, so can't speak to it, but I think that's probably another example of how do we do the critique, but then also not fall into the trap.
Yeah, I think we have to I think the ad is actually a Trump ad that says Biden is weak on China. But I think we really have to strategically now, before it becomes a campaign issue, sort of cut it off before it becomes too big of a mainstream issue. And I think, again, what Rata and Sheena were saying is that we need to emphasize international solidarity during this global pandemic, that we're all impacted, that a cough from around the world is changing all of us, continents away. And so we're super interconnected, and we need to not just fight for our individual rights to consume, like Julie says, but we need to have a sense of corporate responsibility. I think, again, that's where our Asian traditions, everybody's got to use Julie's book, as it should be a required Asian American Studies textbook, but it talks about how we have Asian resources for environmental justice. And I think we need to sort of reclaim the sense of corporate responsibility rather than pushing for individual rights of justice. And as we do that, then we would take a sort of global responsibility, both for the world and for our fellow humans, to challenge the sort of nationalistic impulse that's being driven by both nations now. But I don't know how to change that narrative. That's really hard. That's why we need artists and writers to change the narrative.
It seems like historically, whenever there was a crisis, yellow peril is always posed, to divert, distract. The use of the Asian enemy stereotype. I think even the last, I think during the time of Wen Ho Lee, there was a presidential election there. There's accusations of Democrats being weak on China. Before that, there was that John Wong Asian finance money scandal. Yellow peril was raised there. So it's something that's consistent that the Asian American community definitely has to confront and deal with. And I think as far as what the environmental justice movement is about, the internationalism, people coming together, the anti-racism part, the anti-yellow peril should also be a key component of that. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so there's another question. Okay. How should we deal with the inflammation of nationalism due to the recent incidents, such as COVID-19 and the trade war? I think that was kind of similar to what we've been discussing, but does anybody have anything direct to address that? Okay, if not, then please talk about whether a wider publicizing of racial attacks would promote a greater community rejection of this behavior or invite more of this problem. Okay. I guess that would be Russell.
Oh, do you think we could go rotate the speakers?
Oh, okay. Ratha?
Okay. Yeah, I think this question kind of relates to the one earlier in terms of what do we do with anti-Asian discrimination and sentiment. One, I think, yes, reporting it and sharing it out is good. However, I think what we're trying to do is build a counter narrative and reframe what that is. And I believe that by making acts of solidarity and talking about solidarity and showing up, and that also means is how do we show up for other communities that have been impacted unfairly as well. So by us showing up in solidarity, we also invite that solidarity back. And I think it's really hard when those instances come up, because one, not only does that contribute to just actual physical discrimination and violence in an unhealthy environment, a hostile environment, it contributes to the psychological trauma that we've built over, that many communities have built over, that have been impacted by a lot of injustices. So of course, like, we're going to get triggered when this situation comes about. And what we don't want to happen is to really have it really spiral out of control, where we get triggered and to the point where we start becoming hostile as well. And I think that's a really difficult thing in terms of like how violence and hostility can invite more violence and hostility. And to really counter that is to really be peaceful, to really look and branch out those acts of solidarity and to talk about it. And, you know, a good example that I had was before, I think this was probably in January, before even the lockdown happened. I was on a bus ride back, and I had my skateboard, and in the front there was this white guy and this Asian lady, and this white guy started being really mean to the Asian lady. And it got to the point where at the last stop, as she was leaving, he tried to spit on her. And immediately the people, there was a black lady next to her and a white lady, and then I myself sat, like, we confronted him, and it was a whole thing. But however, out of that situation was what I saw out of it was like, yes, that was an act of discrimination. And I also saw an act of solidarity that I really feel needs to be vocalized, because I think that's the time that we're going to be in terms of how do we think about solving these complex problems in a way that we haven't before. And I think that kind of segues to one of the other questions, and before I'll pass it off to my colleague. And yeah, so I think as the corporations, like, for example, look for bailouts, I think it's time for us to not think about bailouts and start thinking about buyouts. So I know that there has been a signature gathering movement to propose to the federal government that if oil companies try to seek bailouts, how can we instead look to have a buyout of those corporations? So yeah, I know those are kind of diverging topics, but yeah, I want to give my time.
Okay, and then
add to a couple of things that Rafa just brought up and some of the other speakers. I definitely think, yeah, it's a hard place that we're in, and we're being inundated with news about crises even before this pandemic started. That's kind of just how our media system works. And so that can be really stressful. And I think without giving people, just sharing that, without giving people concrete ways to do something about it, is just really stressful, and it doesn't help the organizing. So my mind went to kind of what Russell had brought up in terms of like the threats coming from policy, or Julie was talking about kind of like green capitalism, all these false solutions that are being presented to us as ways out, and the opportunity for us to actually make sure that we're a part of decision making to get ahead of some of those things. And so I think in addition to the increased violence that our communities are facing right now, I'm thinking also to the violence of pollution and toxicity that we're being exposed to all the time, and the ways that our communities are consistently left behind in disasters. My mind kind of went to But when preparing for this talk, was thinking about Hurricane Harvey and Typhoon Haiyan as like two big, huge storms that impacted Asian communities in different ways. So Hurricane Harvey, that hit like an area with high petrochemical use, but that's also where 1 in 5 people in those communities didn't speak a lot of English. And how do people get the information that they need to get out of situations like that if they're not prepared? And that was one of APEN's flagship campaigns back in the 90s, to do a multilingual warning system with the Richmond refinery, which could see the same thing with sea level rise in terms of that kind of climate plus industrial disaster. So how do we make sure that our communities are part of that? And so last year, we even worked on a bill that was requiring community engagement and cultural competency in emergency planning. So making sure that as the state and counties develop their emergency plans, how are they consulting with our communities in language? How are they making sure that people don't feel threatened when they actually are seeking shelter, like we saw with the wildfires, of undocumented folks being too afraid to access help, or queer folks not being welcome in shelters, and just the different facets of communities that people who are currently making the decisions just are not thinking about. And so how do we kind of embed our needs and our leadership, not just in making policy, but like the implementation and the structures of how we can respond. And then I think just to respond also to Rotha's last point about kind of like the bailouts and the corporate takeover and corporate giveaways at this time, we have some opportunities this year as well. November, on the ballot, we have a chance to vote for Schools and Communities First, which is a chance to close a corporate tax loophole and get $11 billion for public education and local services that we're definitely going to need in this time. And we're also working on a California Green New Deal. And so definitely seeing that, that level of mobilization with strong progressive values and a strong safety net, and taking a bold step to transition our economy away from the extractive economy that's just making everything worse in a public health crisis, deeply investing in jobs and healthcare, housing, education, immigrant justice, racial justice, in tangible ways as a really strong response instead of kind of what we're seeing at the federal level. So I just wanted to throw that out there as two kind of state level things that are happening this year too.
We have one more final question, and this person asks, what are more specific examples of coalition building among other marginalized communities of color who are facing the same thing but come from different backgrounds? So the question is about, is solidarity taking place? Is APEN involved in coalition building? Can you talk about some of that, or maybe Rotha can address it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've been a part of a lot of different coalitions. The most recent one is the Richmond Our Power Coalition. I think what we really tried to do there in terms of how do we bring folks from different walks of life together was we tried to identify activities that would be beneficial for everybody, and we tried to target it's for me, it's like I would recommend for coalitions to target things that you can't do by yourself, right? So try to really figure out what are all those things that are impacting your communities, and how can you change and how can you organize and make that change happen. So something that we did was the People's Assembly. So we basically canvass, and instead of usually canvassing with a script and getting people to ask for a signature, we canvass relationships, and we asked how they were doing, and we really got really long, paragraph-long qualitative data on just what the communities have been impacting. And the impacts was housing, gentrification, but also like their safety. Folks are really concerned about their safety from the amount of police that were in the community, and a whole bunch of other stuff. But the People's Assembly was a way to help bring people from walks of life together and help mobilize around a platform. And then when we were able to create a platform, and then that kind of creates your campaign for a coalition. But definitely doing a groundwork first of getting people together, getting people grounded together, getting people to appreciate one another is like a lot of work too. There's a lot of work to foster the relationships in the coalition before the coalition goes out and do campaign work.
Okay, so so with that, we'll end our panel today. It definitely today I actually learned quite a lot, you know, from the different communities and the different struggles and everybody's lives. I didn't know Julie grew up in New York, Chinatown, and and that Russell's family also had SF Chinatown background, and Sheena's family had to deal with the refinery toxic releases. I knew a little bit about Ratha from his UC Berkeley days, but definitely for myself, I'm much more informed about the environmental justice issue, and I'm pretty sure that the audience has also. What may seem like a radical demand is, you know, this idea of access to healthcare. It's not a radical demand. It's a right, and access to clean and healthy environment is also a right. And I just wanted to thank everybody for affirming that. Okay. So what can people do? Well, people know how to get in touch with Asian Pacific Environmental Network. They know how to get in touch with Ratha, Julie, Russell with regards to the anti-hate campaign. So definitely we need to build solidarity more than ever. Julie's emphasis that we are in a particular moment in history and we need to act on it now. Definitely read Julie's book, support your community institutions. Okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Harvey. And I wanted to echo all of the thank yous. And I know we're a little over time, so thank you so much for everyone still staying with us. I wanted to also follow up with a special announcement, which is that OACC and Eastwind Books, we're launching a Giving Tuesday Now campaign to help raise funds so that we can continue events like this for our community. So if you were inspired at all and you would like to see good work like this continue to be out there, our goal is $5,000 by May 5th. We will also post this link as well as all of the other information that was shared out in the chat. We will definitely share that out with everyone as soon as possible. And once again, thank you. Stay positive, stay connected, and I hope you have a great week. Thank you, everyone.